Well, hello and welcome to our fifth annual Prenatal-to-3 Research to Policy Summit. I'm Cynthia Osborne, and I have the privilege of directing the Prenatal-to-3 Policy Impact Center here at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. And it is really hard to believe that this is our fifth roadmap. Woo! And we are so thrilled that over 2,000 of you registered to join us today to recognize and celebrate the amazing progress that states have made this past year in implementing evidence-based policies that we know will help all children thrive from the start. Before I get too much further, I want to just make sure to go over a few housekeeping items. The chat box is not enabled, but we do strongly encourage you to put questions in the Q&A, and my team will be fielding responses to your questions throughout. And if there's something that we can't answer, we'll get your information and get back to you afterwards. I also encourage you to stay on to the very end because we have a survey that we would love for you to fill out to help us to know that, what it is that you got out of today, what you would need more of, and how we can help you moving forward in this next year. This webinar is going to be recorded, and so to just make sure that you're aware of that. And everything will be available both on our website, and we will send to you a copy of a link so that you have access to it. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited to get started. For those of you who have been to any of our policy summits in the past or who are familiar with our center, you know that every year we create an annual roadmap, and this roadmap serves as a guide to state policy leaders as you try to identify and implement the most effective policies that will help improve the health and well-being of infants and toddlers and their parents. Every year, we continue to try to identify what the most effective policies are, and we monitor states' progress toward implementing these effective policies. We want to know their legislative changes, the administrative changes that they have, and everything is documented in the roadmap. And today, we're going to share with you the progress that states have made this past year in implementing effective solutions. And I'm also going to illustrate for you how these policies interact with one another to really create this system of support for infants and toddlers and their families. However, like you all know, policy is a long game and it doesn't typically happen overnight. And to this end, we are very excited to welcome 3 senators from Mississippi, Virginia, and Georgia who are going to share what their states did this past year. And in each case, they were not fully successful in meeting the policy goal that they had, but they took strides in directions that they really hadn't previously. And, we learn as much from the things that we try, even if we're not as successful as those things that we win. So we're excited to be joined by them, and we'll hear from them in a few minutes. But before I go into what the progress is that states made in implementing policies, I think it's always important that we step back and remember kind of why we do this work at all. And it's because the science just couldn't be clearer that the earliest years of a child's life, beginning prenatally and up to age 3, are the most rapid and sensitive period of development. And this developmental period really lays the foundation, sets them on a trajectory for health and well-being across their life course. And our brains are expecting input from our environment to help us to understand the language that we speak and who our special person is and what's safe and what's scary. And the research is really clear that nurturing relationships between caregivers and children are really the key to healthy brain and body development, especially when these occur in an environment that is safe and stable and stimulating and with limited exposure to adversity. And our research team operationalized all of this science into 8 prenatal-to-3 policy goals. So these are the conditions that foster healthy development in infants and toddlers, and that really not only help them in the short term, but will have positive impacts on their life across their whole life course. If all of our children could experience these sorts of environments in their earliest years, that they would be able to reach their optimal potential. And that's not only beneficial for them, but it's beneficial for all of society. And in our roadmap, we provide detailed information for you on a set of indicators of how children are doing toward with regard to their well-being for each of these policy goals. On the navigation bar, you can either look for the United States information for child and family outcomes, or you can get it for your own state to see your state level outcomes. And this information can be really helpful as you try to prioritize what it is that you need to focus on to really support families in your state. However, there really are a host of resources out there that are very good at telling you how children in your state are doing. But our whole mission is to tell you and to help you to understand how kids in your state can do better. And that is the whole purpose of our state policy roadmap. You've probably heard me say this before if you've ever seen me give a talk, but we have reviewed everything that's ever been written on state level policies, thousands of documents, and hundreds of the most rigorous studies that have been conducted to really identify what works for improving outcomes for infants and toddlers and their parents. And we've identified 4 effective policies and 8 effective strategies that really help to create those conditions in which our children thrive. And I invite you to check out each of these 12 effective policies and strategies in the roadmap. And for each one, we provide detailed information on even what it is, what the evidence says of the benefits that it has for little ones and their parents. We provide information on how states vary in terms of the generosity and the reach of these policies. And we provide extensive information for every state on the progress that they made over the past year in trying to implement these policies or increase access to strategies. But in addition, I invite you to check out our clearinghouse because it's there that we provide all the background information on how we have chosen the 12 effective policies and strategies that are on our roadmap. So we have a comprehensive review of each of those, as well as a dozen other or more of policies that actually need further study. And I'm very excited to share with you that we have just recently added 3 new evidence reviews to the clearinghouse. 2 that are related to early literacy, our shared book reading programs and emergent literacy coaching, and 1 that is associated with cash transfers. And all of these show that they do improve outcomes for infants or toddlers and their parents, but we are still trying to better understand what the state levers are that states can really pull in order to increase access to these for families in your state. So hopefully next year, they're all going to be on the roadmap. But this grid is our roadmap. This shows you how those 8 policy goals that, as I said, create those conditions in which children thrive are aligned with our 12 effective solutions. And you can see that some of the policies impact a number of the goals, like paid family and medical leave impacts 7 out of our 8 policy goals. And other effective solutions are more targeted and impact only 1 or 2 goals. But all of them have an impact on the well-being of children and families. And we really want states to think of creating a system of support for families and try to implement all of these effective policies. Okay, so now I want to tell you how states have made progress over this past year in implementing all of those effective evidence-based policies and strategies. And what we saw was that 3 states implemented 4 new effective policies since our last roadmap. North Carolina expanded Medicaid. Colorado implemented a paid family and medical leave program for the first time. And Montana implemented 2 policies. It both increased its minimum wage to over $10 an hour, and it expanded its state earned income tax credit from 3 to 10%. So good for Montana for this year. However, I will say that this year, the progress that states made was not quite as robust as it was last year when 7 states implemented 9 effective policies. And all of the policies that were implemented this year were actually set by legislation that happened in years prior. But nevertheless, families in the states, these states now have access to these benefits because the states have started to implement this. And that's really important. I'm also going to share with you in a minute some of the investments that states have made that have been pretty substantial in our effective strategies. But I'm going to begin with the policies, and I'm going to start with Medicaid expansion. So, the research is clear that Medicaid expansion not only increases access to health care, but it also helps to create financial stability in families. It improves birth outcomes for both the moms and the babies, and it reduces child maltreatment. And in December 2023, North Carolina became the 41st state to expand Medicaid, including the District of Columbia. And in the first 6 months following expansion, more than 500,000 people enrolled in the program. And that's really impressive. But it's also important to know that there are additional states of the 10 non-expansion states that actually made considerable progress this past year, even though they weren't entirely successful. We're going to hear from Senator Boyd from Mississippi because it came very close to expanding Medicaid for the first time this past year. And Alabama actually introduced a bill that would allow the state to spend gambling revenue to cover health care coverage for low-income individuals. And in Kansas, they actually held their first hearing on Medicaid expansion in 4 years. So again, although they weren't successful, there were great strides that were made. Where we did see a lot of progress was in paid family and medical leave. Colorado is now the 10th state to implement its paid family and medical leave program. It passed legislation in 2020, and in January of this year, families began being able to access 12 weeks of paid leave following the birth, adoption, or foster placement of the child, or they could use it for their own medical purposes or to care for a sick family member. There are 4 more states, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, and Minnesota, that will be implementing their program in the next year. And this is a very popular program with states. It's one of the most pro-work policies that exist. And in addition to folks being more likely to return to their pre-birth employment, more likely to work, it improves financial security, it improves parenting practices, mental health, children's well-being. And importantly, it's important, we need to remember that it is cost neutral to states, that for every one of the 10 states that have one of these programs, either workers and or the employers pay a very small amount into a social insurance program. And it's a program in which everyone pays and everyone benefits. And in fact, we conducted a benefit cost analysis for a proposed paid leave program in Pennsylvania, and we showed that the benefits to cost were 18 to 1, which are simply huge. And this past year, 15 states introduced legislation that would have provided a statewide paid family leave program. Rhode Island actually passed a bill that expanded its program from 6 to 7 weeks beginning next year and 8 weeks in the following year. And both New Mexico and Hawaii came very close to passing a bill. And we're going to hear from Senator Boysko about a bill that she introduced in Virginia that was actually passed by the legislation that for 8 weeks of paid leave, but was ultimately vetoed by Governor Youngkin. It's important, though, to remember that state paid family leave programs vary quite considerably in terms of who's eligible, how many weeks of leave you can take, the wage replacement, and all of this variation in policy levers leads to wide variation in the amount of benefits that families have available to them. So from this chart, you can see that a person, if we just focus on the bonding leave portion of the programs, that in Rhode Island, a new parent would have 6 weeks and get about $4,500 of their wages replaced. Whereas if they lived in Oregon, they would have 12 weeks and get over $12,000 of paid leave benefit. A minimum wage, the current research shows that a minimum wage that's at least $10 an hour not only improves the financial stability of low-income households, it also leads to better birth outcomes in the state and reductions in child maltreatment. And Montana became the 30th state this past year to really go above that $10 threshold. It increased its minimum wage from $9.95 to $10.30 an hour, which is about $700 an annual increase for a minimum wage worker and equivalent to about 5 weeks of groceries. Um, but there was a lot of progress in more than half of states increased their minimum wage this past year. Um, most of them did it because of previously scheduled increases or because they index it to inflation. But the value of the increases were pretty large in some states. In Hawaii, they increased the value by $2 an hour, which is more than $4,000 a year for a minimum wage worker, as compared to, say, in Michigan, where the increase was only 23 cents. And what's really fascinating now is that there are 8 states that have a minimum wage that is $15 or higher. And there are another 6 states that are likely going to reach that threshold in another 2 years. So we'll probably be able to learn more about what the optimal minimum wage is. Of the 21 states that haven't yet met that $10 threshold, none of them increased their wage this past year. And all but one, West Virginia, have their minimum wages set to the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. And that wage hasn't been increased since 2009. 14 of these 21 states did introduce legislation that would have pushed them over the $10 threshold, but none was successful. So the final roadmap policy is a refundable state earned income tax credit that's at least 10% of the federal credit. And this year, Montana expanded its EITC from 3 to 10% of the federal credit, making it the 23rd state to pass this benchmark. And an EITC is also a very pro-work policy. It has an impact on providing greater financial stability for families and reduces adverse birth outcomes. And there, in addition to Montana, Colorado and Rhode Island also expanded their EITCs. Colorado went from 38 to 50%, and Rhode Island from 15 to 16%. But you can see the value of a state's EITC varies quite considerably from 70% in the District of Columbia to only 4% for families with only one child in Wisconsin. What a pattern that we saw this year, though, is that in addition to EITCs, more states are implementing child tax credits. And after seeing the success of the temporary expansion of the federal child tax credit, we have seen more and more states move in this direction, such that 12 states now have a refundable child tax credit, and another 4 have a non-refundable tax credit. And there are even more states that have been considering legislation. And what we're happy to see is that states are starting to think about all of their taxes and their tax credits in one package, more jointly versus only individually. Now, the research has not been able to keep abreast of all of the changes that states are making, but we are watching it and we are hopeful that this is going to show positive benefits for infants and toddlers and their parents, and that we'll be able to add these to the roadmap in the near future. But as you can see, the variation in state child tax credits is quite large, like other policies are. The most generous child tax credit is in Minnesota at $1,750 per child. But Colorado this year implemented a new kind of sort of child tax credit called the Family Affordability Tax Credit. And this really expanded the resources available to new families in Colorado. But it's also true that as incomes increase, the value of the credits will go down. That's the way most tax credits work. This is a family with only $10,000 in earnings. If a family earned $30,000 in earnings, you can see that the value starts to decline in many states. And once we get to $60,000 in earnings, there are only 6 of the states, or excuse me, only 10 of the 16 states that have any value left into their tax credit. So, of all the policy changes that we saw this year, that means that now we have 10 states that are implementing all 4 of the effective policies. Colorado entered this group for the first time this year when it implemented its paid family medical leave program. And Montana jumped 2 spots with now implementing 3 out of 4 of the effective policies. And North Carolina, because it introduced Medicaid expansion, now is not among the 8 remaining states that have yet to introduce any of the effective policies. And despite the kind of more modest progress that states made in our effective policies, they actually did make quite a bit of progress on several of our effective strategies. Many of you have heard me say this before about what the difference is between a policy and a strategy. And for a policy, the research is clear of kind of what states actually need to do in order to see the benefits that the research tells us is possible. For a strategy, the research doesn't guide us in the same way, but we have leaned on the research as much as we could. We've spoken with experts, and we've identified different levers that states can implement in order to try to increase access to these effective solutions. In the US roadmap summary, we provide an overview of what all of these are, and we go into great detail on each of them individually. And I'm going to move through a few of them fairly quickly. So just to kind of note that both Georgia and Oregon increased their recertification period from 6 to 12 months for all families with children, which really reduces the administrative burden on receiving SNAP. That there are 3 more states that bring the total to 6 that have a statewide goal of implementing Family Connects. What's not listed here are the investments that Arkansas and New York have made in Healthy Steps and the kind of expansion of the Dolce Comprehensive Screening and Connection Program. And 5 more states now offer an enhanced reimbursement rate for group prenatal care, bringing that total to 14 states. There was really considerable progress on those this past year. But the area that we saw the greatest growth was in using Medicaid to support doula services. So this year, 7 new states began using Medicaid to cover doula services, including community-based doulas, which is where the research is the most robust. That 7 new states have begun doing that this year, and actually 6 additional states are in the process of doing that. And when this is all said and done, we'll basically double the number of states that are including or using Medicaid to cover doulas. And there are even additional states that are considering this. But just because a state uses Medicaid to cover doulas does not mean that they all have the same type of coverage, the amount of coverage, what they cover. There's a wide variation. And you can see that in this graphic. California reimburses doulas at more than $3,200 for the services provided. And this is actually on parity in the state for midwives and OBs, as compared to Maryland, where the reimbursement rate is just above $900. Okay, finally, let's talk about childcare subsidies. I could talk about childcare subsidies all day because there has been a lot of activity. I'm not going to for the interest of time. But as I said, there has been a ton of activity, but it hasn't all been in the direction that we wish that it would go in. There have been a lot of changes that have taken place over this past year. Some states are doing better, and other states are pulling a little bit further behind. So, with regard to income eligibility, Kansas and Kentucky now have set their income eligibility limits to set 85% of their state's median income for the first time. Unfortunately, North Dakota now it's kind of no longer at the 85th percent, it's at 81. And Nevada cut its income limit by about half to 44% this past year. Um, 27 states, excuse me, now limit their co-payments to 7% of a family income or less. And this is up from 24 states of the last year. New to this group are Delaware, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. But unfortunately, Louisiana and Nevada have fallen out of that group. And finally, reimbursement rates. 29 states just released new market rate surveys, and they all show that the cost of childcare is going up. But unfortunately, the reimbursement rates are not quite keeping track at this point. That could change. Um, this year, there are only 13 states that set their reimbursement rates at the 75th percentile of the market rate, which is what the federal government calls the equal access target, um, or that they use a cost estimation model. Last year, this number was 26. Um, Colorado is now using a cost estimation model for the first time, and Missouri and Oregon are now setting their rates at the 75th percentile, but there have been many states that have fallen out. But we have seen that at least 16 states increased the funding for childcare subsidies, and some did it quite substantially. Look at Maryland and Virginia's investments. I mean, these are big investments that they have made. And another trend that we saw is that states are looking for alternative dedicated funding sources, that the federal and state dollars for childcare are simply not enough to meet the needs that they have. And so they're, even though they were unsuccessful this year, have become more and more innovative in how they are trying to tap into sports betting or taxes or car services, land trusts, in order to have these dedicated funds. Okay, I invite you to check out all of the progress that states have made this past year. You can look in the US roadmap summary to see the progress at the US level, or you can also check it out for your state. So for every state, we have a summary of what you have done, and you can see how you've met your goals and how you compare to other states. Well, as I mentioned, however, that although there's been a lot of progress that states have made, and they should feel very proud of themselves, our work is never over, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we are actually here to be a resource for you as you prepare for your next legislative session, and we're going to be tracking what you do. And like I said, policy is a long game. And so I am so excited that today we are joined by Senator Nicole Boyd, Senator Jennifer Boysko, and Senator Brian Strickland to help us to understand how they pushed forward efforts to try to meet their state's goals. Even though they may not have been successful this legislative session, there was quite a bit that they learned and that they can share with us. So please join me now in welcoming Senator Boyd, Senator Boysko, and Senator Strickland. Good afternoon and welcome. So glad that you're here with us today, and so appreciate your time. Like I said, you all did big things this past year. You may not have reached every goal that you had, but you made substantial progress. And Senator Boyd, I'd love to start with you. Mississippi almost passed Medicaid expansion. That was making the headlines. And I can tell you, we at the center were sending emails back and forth, or did you see this? Did you see this? Oh my goodness. help us to understand why now. Why was Mississippi interested in doing this year? Tell us about the progress that you did make and some of the hurdles that you kind of faced and what that might mean for next year.
So last year in Mississippi had their elections, and the former Speaker of the House chose not to run again. And so you had new House leadership. And prior to last January, we had already had the speaker, former speaker, had said that he absolutely would not consider Medicaid expansion. And so that was something we kind of knew was a non-starter because our governor was opposed to it as well. And so when we had new leadership in the House, they actually quickly passed out a full expansion bill. And so they passed that out and then sent it over to the Senate. And the Senate then took a more conservative approach in looking at it and looked at kind of an approach similar to Georgia's in some way, but not, but had some really significant work requirements in it, but had a good number of exceptions as well that were very workable and doable. And basically, then sent that back over. And so we went to conference on the bill because the bills were dramatically different. We had a lot of people in the state that had opinions one way or the other. And a lot of our hospitals had a lot of people that were on the exchange and had a really good success with people on the exchange. We also had a number of providers that had had a lot of success with people on the exchange. So they did not have a interest in the exchange being done away with. So that expansion plan then was going to need to cover the exchange. And so this was the first year we really had hearings about it. It was the first year we really kind of went in depth and into the weeds as to what the policies would look like, looked at funding of it for long term and all of that. And at the end of the day, it was almost perfect was the enemy of good in getting something passed because everybody felt like they had kind of had their perfect solution, but they couldn't reach compromise on it. So it is already, people are already talking about it for January. There's lots of conversations there being had right now. We left some conference reports on the table, which is a good place to start. And so I think come January, you're going to see this heat back up once again for looking at that. But so I think people are having the right discussions though right now and really kind of getting into the weeds into every aspect on it. So I think also to the election come November is going to play a huge part in what that looks like. So that's one of the things too, is to see what the outcome of the election is and to see what, if any, impact that has on it.
Well, it's very exciting to know that you are even considering it now. And again, we're nonpartisan and don't take a
Right.
stance on a particular bill, but the research is pretty clear that Medicaid expansion will do quite a bit for the little ones and their parents. So it's exciting that you're considering that. You mentioned that your approach with work requirements was a lot slightly modeled on George's approach. And Senator Strickland, I just wonder if you can tell us more about how the work requirement piece has had a little slower uptake in Georgia than you may have anticipated. Do you feel like in Georgia things are going to stay as they are, let it kind of play out for a little longer? Do you anticipate any changes there or any advice you could give to Senator Boyd?
Yeah, well, thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate you putting this on, and thank everyone at the 3 Policy Center for doing this. I've already learned a lot just watching today as well, and obviously great to be joined by my colleagues from Mississippi and Virginia as well. As you mentioned in Georgia, so we passed a pathways program that was under Governor Kemp back in 2019, I believe, in his first year in office. The previous governor had actually pushed the legislature to take the power away from the governor to expand Medicaid in Georgia. And there was a big movement away from ever having expansion in our state. And that changed to Governor Kemp. Governor Kemp wanted to try something different. And so we created a Georgia model that was mentioned. And the problem is we ended up with litigation over that. It's been a very slow rollout. And so we have not really had time to see how well it's working or how it's not working. And despite that, Governor Kemp pushed for another study of our current laws this past session. And we currently have great people that are experts in the healthcare industry on a committee that's going to make more recommendations as to our current model, what we can do to get more coverage every corner of our state. Like a lot of states, probably all that are watching, there's two Georgias, there's the Atlanta metro area, and then there's the rest of the state. And you're seeing completely different outcomes based on where you live when it comes to access to care.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I will say that we're watching the work requirements. None of the research to date is able to say that the work requirements provide the same level of benefits, if they don't exist. But we are going to be watching to learn from you all for sure. Well, Senator Boysko, I want to come to you because Virginia had as close as you can get to passing a paid family medical leave bill. I will say once it passed, we did a little celebration here at the center, knowing that it was likely to be vetoed, but it's still nice to see that states have had a conversation about this effective policy. Can you help us to understand kind of why it is, what motivated you to introduce this bill and think about providing this benefit for families? And you introduced a more generous bill. Help us to understand the compromises that had to be made along the way. And then ultimately, take us through what the outcomes were and where you might be headed in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Cynthia. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with my colleagues from other states as well. And I love that this is a bipartisan panel. In Virginia, I've been working on this since 2019, which was the year that I moved from the House over to the Senate. And we've heard from so many people, from small business owners, from employees, from family members and friends, that having a paid family medical leave program would make an enormous difference in their lives and help them keep their jobs, which we want people to do. And you went over the data really well and explained why this is such a valuable and important and high priority. So starting in 2019, I began working with some of the national experts who have been doing this in other states and making sure that I was using best language that has been effective in other areas. And it would be basically the gold standard would be a 12-week program allowing an insurance program in the Commonwealth paid by a small deductible by the employee. So if you make $60,000, it's 1/2 of 1%. That would be about the cost of a cup of coffee for the employee and for the employer. And that would allow them to, if they have a qualifying event like bringing a baby home, adopting a child or foster care, or caring for a very sick loved one, or for yourself, the ability to take that time away. And we also would make certain that the employee would have their job when they got back. This has been the process in other states and has been effective, as you mentioned so clearly, that it has not had a negative impact on the business community. And so I've gotten it through the Senate a couple of times, and in the House, it always helped, was left there. This has happened with, I happen to be a Democrat. It's happened with Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate. It has happened in a mixed majority in each house. So it's not necessarily a partisan issue. I think the difference here in 2024 was, one, we really listened to the stakeholders from the big businesses who said they already have their own programs. So we opted them out and said if they have an equal program, they wouldn't have to pay into the fund. Secondly, we made certain that if a very small business, 10 employees or fewer, the employer wouldn't be required to pay in because they said it might be too expensive for them. So the employee would pay their portion. And
Yeah.
then also for people who are self-employed or contractors like Uber drivers or delivery folks, we gave them the ability to pay into the program so that they could also receive those benefits. And we got it through the Senate successfully. And when it got over to the House, there were some concerns around the cost for the Commonwealth of Virginia because, we are the biggest employer in the entire state and what that cost would be. So I agreed to compromise and shorten it to 8 weeks rather than 12 weeks because in the Commonwealth, we already have a parental leave benefit of 8 weeks, and there is a disability benefit for the employees. And then we agreed that there would be a study to be undertaken to examine the cost and how we would achieve covering all employees in the Commonwealth who are employed by the government or by our school system. And that report is coming out in December, and I'm very much looking forward to it. We've already done an actuarial study. We already did an implementation study over the past several years. So we know that we've got good data and information on how this will work. I think the reason that we were able to get it through the House and the Senate this year is because we've had a real generational change in the General Assembly. Half of the Senate is new this year, and about a third of the House of Delegates, 100 members, are new also. So new Speaker of the House who was open, our Speaker was open to considering this. And new members more families with young children who have been struggling through these issues themselves. I think that made a big difference. Plus the allowances that we made for the small businesses and the big businesses to give them a little bit more flexibility. I'll be carrying it again this year. I know that the governor will veto it again. This is going to be his fine. In Virginia, we have a 4-year max for our governors. They can only serve 1 term. So in 2025, we will have a new election and we'll have a new governor. And I'm hoping that that will be a family-friendly person who wins, because this is an important issue for so many families.
It is a really important benefit for so many families, and not just for the childbearing, which is what we focus on at the Prenatal-to-3 Policy Impact Center, but for the caregiving as well. But Senator Strickland, you carried a bill in Georgia to expand your state program from 3 to 6 weeks. What motivated you to want to expand the state program? And do you see Georgia moving toward a statewide, more social insurance sort of program in any sort of near future?
Well, as Senator Boysko was saying, I'm a good example of this in Georgia. Now, I've served 12 years in the legislature. I was in the House for 5 years, 4 in the Senate. But when I started out, I was single, no kids, wouldn't even married yet. I'm now married with 2 little boys. I've got a wife that works full time. In the Senate, there's a handful of us in similar situations. And I think, just thinking about it out loud for a second, I believe almost every other colleague with young children has a spouse who also works full time. And so that is a big factor in making policy change, is electing people that can relate to these issues. And so in Georgia, as you mentioned, we had a bill this past session. I carried it in the Senate as a House bill that the Speaker pro tem in the House carried, which was also a sign that it was meant to be a bill from leadership in the House. And it doubled from 3 to 6 weeks time that state employees, which we have to remember includes teachers in our districts, have for paternal leave. And to be honest with you, when I first heard of the bill, I felt guilty. I haven't called this before. I did not realize how low our leave period was for 3 weeks. And it's watching my wife with our 2 little boys. The first baby was born and I was in front of a jury the next week because I had to in my day job as an attorney. And I was extra tired and I was a little groggy in front of that jury and asked them for forgiveness for that. But I could go back to work right away. My wife was not able to, and had to obviously have a different accommodation once she went back to work when she was pumping. And so it definitely was personal to me. And to get to your actual question you asked about, are we moving towards the statewide model? I don't know. It was very difficult to pass that bill. It's taken this long for us to go to 6 weeks. when the bill came over to the Senate, I guess I had told enough people I liked the bill that it was no doubt it was being handed to me to carry. And when I received the folder, as we do, I'm not sure if it works with my colleagues the same way. If someone carries a bill in the other chamber, we try to create a folder for them that has everything they need to know. And so you have a heads up to expect on your side, because usually it's very similar. And the folder I saw was all what we call defense. It was, well, it's not really going to cost the state anything. It's only going to impact this many people. It was all the reasons why, despite the fact you may not like it, you should vote for it. And I pushed that folder aside. It kind of made me mad. And said, I'm going to embrace this bill. And I carried it in an opposite way and said, this is not enough. As I said here, I wish we had done this sooner. We should do more. This is not enough for the workers in our state. And we as a state should set a model for private businesses. And we're not doing that. And the bill did get, I meant to look up and I forgot to do it before we started today, did get some no votes. It did pass. But I picked up extra opposition because of the approach I took. But it was important to me to have that fight on this issue. And some people said, can fathers take advantage of this? And the answer is, I hope they will. Yes, they can. We need fathers at home with young children too. And so there was some pushback. But I think the more that we take on issues like this and embrace them, it gives more courage for policymakers that we can pass stuff like this. Georgia is still a very conservative state. I'm Republican. Legislature is controlled by Republicans. Every statewide office is Republican, and we do not have a history of always embracing policies like this. And I think you're seeing some of that change, and you realize it's not Republican, Democrat. It's just the right thing to do. And even if you look at it from a pure financial standpoint and what it costs the state and decrease in the size of government, policies like this actually make Georgia a better employer, which means we can hire more people and provide better services and maybe spend less money in doing all that. And so sometimes you have to twist the debate a little bit away from just this is the right thing to do, but it also saves the state money as well in the long run.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The benefit cost analyses that we're doing for states continue to show the annual returns to both the state and to the families. But Senator Boyd, just wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in on Mississippi's chances for any tea leaves on paid leave in Mississippi.
Well, I'll have to say, at the encouragement of one of my Georgia colleagues that's actually in the House, we have actually introduced a bill on this particular issue last session, but it didn't get any momentum. But we're in the process right now in Mississippi of having another set of hearings on our Women, Children's and Family, which is a study group that the Lieutenant Governor commissioned several years ago after we overturned Roe v. Wade. And so that commission is really looking at right now paid family leave, and we'll be having hearings on that to try to. We're one of the 11 states that does not offer, for our state employees, does not offer any type of maternity or paternity leave. So we will be looking into that and having hearings on that in November. So I'm very optimistic and hopeful, because I believe, like Senator Strickland does, that this is the right thing to do for families, and that it sets families up for success when they can take that off. And it also then generates great employees who are full rested, and the economics and the research tends to play out on that. So anyway, so I hope to have something good to report back.
Well, that's very exciting. Well, I'm going to send to you all the resources that I can possibly come up with to support you in that goal. That's very exciting. Well, I want to move to childcare. So Senator Strickland, Georgia got pretty serious about childcare this past year. You considered various alternative funding structures of how to increase the level of funds that would come into the state to support childcare. And you created a committee to really study, and I know the results are supposed to come out in a couple of months, of how to make childcare more accessible and affordable for families. Again, tell us why now? Why are we pushing for more in childcare in Georgia? Where do you see some of the wins? Where do you see some of the future kind of headed? And what are the ultimate goals here?
Yeah, so this past session, we created a Senate study committee on affordability of childcare. I'm not sure if every state, if you're watching, you do these things in a similar way, but we have House study committees and Senate study committees, and our leadership on each side caps how many you have, and they only let so many out. And it was a priority in the Senate for us to have this subcommittee on childcare affordability. And going back to what Senator Boyd also mentioned, maybe Georgia, Mississippi are talking a lot. Our Lieutenant Governor also created a Children and Families Committee last year. And that a lot of the work from that committee started around the foster care issues we're having in our state. A lot of issues with our DFACS program in Georgia, hoteling of children. And so that committee started rolling out a lot of those issues. And the paid paternal leave for state employees bill actually went through that committee this past year. You saw that issue with foster care kind of bubbling up, coupled with following the Dobbs decision. You saw more people really on both sides of the aisle saying, okay, no matter how you feel about that decision, we have to make sure our policies support children and mothers through the process and not just on the front end. And then mixed with all that, something we've heard for years in Georgia is our maternal mortality rate is unacceptable. And it's not something we've seen great progress in despite some efforts. 2 years ago, we went from, I think it was 90 days to 6 months for Medicaid coverage for new mothers in our state, something that we try to get ahead of on that. So all that was come together mixed with our business community, which sometimes doesn't always come to the table to support these kind of issues. They have realized the issue we have with workforce participation. And they have been presenting in every chance you give the Metro Atlanta Chamber or the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, both work together on these issues, a chance to speak. They tell you one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue they see in Georgia, and they're speaking for the big companies, of course, for the most part, is the issues of getting workers, right? And workforce participation, which continues to go down. We know, anyone with kids knows that there's that discussion that every family has to have. I can quit my job and stay home with my child. One parent may do that in a situation. If you're a single parent, you may have no choice, of course. Or I can go take this job and I'm going to spend this much on childcare. If I even have access to childcare, again, we're in two Georgias. Around Atlanta, I might can find childcare, but it's extremely expensive. There are places where no matter how much money you have, it's just not available. And so they've been pushing for us, the Metro, the business community, the Chamber of Commerce crowd, as I put it, have been pushing for us to study this issue more too. And so the study committee has only met once so far. Our second committee was rescheduled because of Hurricane Helene. We have our second hearing next week, and we'll have 2 other hearings before the end of the year. We're going to release a report. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to recommend yet, but you see a great group come together from people like yourself, the people I would consider advocates in this area, to the business community coming in. And it's something that no matter which crowd I speak in front of, whether it's a local Republican Party meeting, a business group of people that never would vote for me politically, they all understand this issue and it's important to them. And so I'm a little bit pessimistic simply because of the challenges I saw with the paid paternal leave issue. I think it's going to take some persuading of some of my colleagues to take some bold steps in this area. And that's where I'll have to have a lot of help from the business community in particular.
Well, that is really important to hear. And one of the trends I've seen over the last several years is the business community stepping in and saying, this is a workforce issue. It's the workforce of today and the workforce of the future, that if we can put high quality childcare in place, that's going to make a huge difference for families and for workers. So Senator Boysko, I know that Virginia also made some pretty substantial investments this year in childcare. You've really shaken things up. We did a benefit cost analysis of the investments you made, and they're coming back to the Commonwealth in positively every year, and going to benefit families over the long haul. Why do you think this is such a bipartisan issue? Where do you see Virginia headed in the direction of childcare moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the number one is housing and childcare are two of the top issues in the Commonwealth. I actually just spent the past 2 days in a conference on education and early childhood here with the Education and Health Committee, and we had an entire panel on high quality childcare, because as you mentioned at the beginning of this, the brain development between the ages of birth to age 5, that is when it happens. And if we want to have a strong workforce who, can take care of us in the next generation, we've got to make certain that we're giving them the right start at the very beginning, which is why I care about things like early childhood education, why I care about things like paid family and medical leave, because we want our kids to grow up to be successful. Virginia is the best state for business in the country. And much of that is based on our strong education system, beginning at, the earliest stages, and having a high quality childcare benefit here in the Commonwealth is a huge part of that. We no longer have a society where, mom stays home and dad goes and makes the money. Most families are two working parents, and it's time that we recognize that and honor that and take care and put our children first. And it's really encouraging for me to see that this, again, is a bipartisan panel and that we're sharing the same values, and that I saw the same thing with our General Assembly. We all care about these kinds of issues, and we are all trying to move forward in the way that is best for the children.
Yeah, yeah. Senator Boyd, what about Mississippi? Is childcare going to be an issue that you grapple with this coming legislative session?
Well, preparing for hearings on November the 14th, we've actually passed some child care tax credits. And I will tell y'all, we passed those 2 years ago. If anybody's looking at those, I will tell you though, we did not do a great job of letting our business community know what we have passed.
Okay.
We did not publicize that well. And so the business community has been coming back to us. And so we've asked, okay, how many of y'all are taking advantage of the child tax credits? And they're like, what tax credits? So I will tell y'all, make sure that you do a better job than we did of letting the business community know what you've done in that arena. But we will be actually we have a joint study commission on women, children, and families, but also in labor force participation rate. So Senator Strickland, I think you're right. Our lieutenant governors have been talking, but anyway, we will be having a joint hearing on that. But we've had some really novel approaches really during the pandemic too, that we've been excited about. One of the vendors that we've been really working with that have really has been upskilling childcare, home house childcare. So if somebody had a 5-person childcare, they have been helping them upskill to increase their capacity on that. So we've really been looking at some of those small things like Senator Strickland we're talking about. If you're outside of, we have so many rural parts of Mississippi, how easy that's to get, and how that we can help these, and it's usually women that are in these smaller, home childcare centers, how we can help them grow their businesses. And that's been really particularly efficacious for us. And that we went to a vendor with that and said, can you help us do that? And so they've created a model in that we're really excited about and really pleased to see their advances in that. So I think we all have to be, this is one where there's not one size fits all, because we have such different populations and states that we have to be creative and out of the box on how that we work through those particular issues. So yeah, it's a hot topic in Mississippi.
It's a hot topic everywhere, in every kitchen table and in every business community and every legislative group, it seems, because this is an area that is so important to families. I want to give you each just a couple of minutes to, you've basically summarized a lot, but what are your priorities moving forward to really try to ensure that all of our infants and toddlers and their parents can thrive, really, so that our parents can do their job of taking care of their kids in the way that we know that they need to best. Senator Strickland, I'll start with you.
Well, obviously, we still have a lot more work to do. To me, the path forward is to give a voice to all those, as you mentioned, sitting around their kitchen tables having these discussions. It's most people I know, but we're all in different bubbles. Maybe it's just my age, but and where I live, but everyone I know is struggling with issues as young parents that are unique and are different based on obviously your income level, what you can get by with, what you can't. And so we all have different challenges, but I hope is that as we see things such as the bill we talked about a few times with paid paternal leave for our state employees, we see that come into effect. I know I was at an event recently, and you don't forget moments like this where a young teacher walked up to me and thanked me for that bill and said, now I can stay home longer with my new baby that's coming. And I hope all my colleagues have experiences like that, because we work on a lot of stuff and we talk about big picture issues. We think we accomplish some great things sometimes. It's not every day you see a real person that you truly made a big impact on, especially at our level. And so I think that's how you're going to see change. It's not just electing more people that can relate, but it's truly giving a voice. Those are not Republicans or Democrats. They're voting different ways for who's going to be the next president of the United States. They have different opinions on a lot of issues, but they all can agree that we got to do more to support young working families. And again, no matter how you look at it, whether you just want to help young working families or you want to see your state be the #1 state for business, which we claim instead of Virginia, by the way, maybe every state claims that. #1 state for business. The great way to be a #1 state for business is to have their workforce there. And the workforce of today expects to be able to raise their family as well. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone that participated today, and thank you for giving me a chance to share and to learn from everyone else on here.
Thank you so much, Senator Strickland. I really appreciate it. Senator Boysko?
Thank you. Yeah, I have worked, really, I've focused my entire career on helping people who, rarely have a seat at the table be heard. And so fighting for things like paid family medical leave, but also things like economic opportunity, like collective bargaining or increasing the minimum wage, or having access for our children to have, food at school without a cost. Those are important issues. We're also going to continue to address our Medicaid program and making sure that it's solvent and serves the community. A thing that I've worked on for a few years has been around keeping guns out of the hands of children. So having adults lock their guns when they're in the home, when there are children or prohibited people in the home, because we know that that's where in school shootings, most of the situations have been that they bring them from home. And then finally, reliable and access to family planning, including the full scope of reproductive health. And I'll be carrying a constitutional amendment around that this year with the Dobbs decision. Certainly that has been the #1 issue for many families who want to make their own decisions without having the government interfere. And so that's a very important issue as well. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and it takes all of us listening to one another and trying to understand one another. And that's what I always try to do, and appreciate that you all are having this forum today to talk about early childhood and the best outcomes that we can have through policy.
Thank you, Senator Boysko. I appreciate all of that. And Senator Boyd, I'm going to give you the final word. Where's Mississippi headed? Where are you taking it?
Well, I think we've so 2 years ago, after the Dobbs decision, we convened our Women, Children's and Family. Our Lieutenant Governor, we had an election year last year, but we passed about 25 different policies and laws. Really, some of them rather comprehensive, some of them kind of very singular issue, all as it relates to women, children, and families, and particularly our foster care system too, as well. And so we're in the kind of throes right now of having those hearings once again, really assessing where we are, if the policies seem to be moving the needle or not. And 2 years is really a short period. It's really more like 18 months that most of this has been implemented. Some of them, even less than that. So we're trying to assess where we are. And I think that's continuously going back and, really looking at that over and over again to see if we are moving the needle and if people are taking advantage, like the tax credit that I mentioned earlier, of the things we actually did pass. One of the things that we are our early intervention system, and I'm a parent of a special needs child that took advantage of our early intervention system that seemed to be more robust at the time than it is now. And so we've had a wonderful committee that has singularly focused on that for the last 2 years. That is really trying to provide a complete revamp and working with our MCOs and getting into the weeds of all of this. And so wonderful partners across the state that have volunteered and have asked to be on that. And that is the beauty of all of these things that we're working on. There are so many people around the state that care about these particular issues. They've texted while I've been on the phone with y'all. I mean, while we've been doing this Zoom, but that care, that have a lot of great information that has really provided a wealth of knowledge for us to be able to look at those programs comprehensively. And I think that's the thing that we've noticed is everything has to be looked at for comprehensively. So we're starting at really before the woman even gets pregnant, then looking at it, how it does with that. So I think that's what's so important, and taking that to how that mental health is being implemented even in our schools. So we're excited about the changes we've implemented. We've seen great success in our schools and in education from taking that comprehensive look over the last few years and seeing how that we've basically come from 50th to 30th in education by taking that comprehensive approach. So we're hopefully we'll be doing that in this arena as well.
Well, that is huge. And I am really the people will talk about the Mississippi Miracle, so it's interesting to see have you mentioned that, and really important. I want to thank each of you for what you do for the children and families in your states, and for giving so much of your time this afternoon to share with all of the folks who are interested in moving policies forward in their state that have, that are proven to actually make a difference in the lives of our babies and their parents. And so again, I hope everyone will join me in thanking you, and we'll be watching and talking with you as you go forward and learning from you as you do it. And we're obviously here to support you. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to share our final session with you today. Let's see if I can get us back up and going here on a slideshow. And the senators were wonderful at kind of setting this up, because they talked about having to look at things comprehensively and think of the whole family. And, our families do not exist in isolation. They don't have the luxury of thinking of one policy at a time. They have to think about where they're going to live, how they'll feed themselves, where they're going to work, how they're going to get there, how they're going to support their children. And so what we wanted to do was to illustrate for you how state policy choices really interact to create a system of support, or at least a minimal level of resources for families. And again, we're focused on the state policy choices, not necessarily all of the income within a state, which I'll explain in a second. So many of you may have been introduced to Lena before, but Lena is a single mom, and she has an infant and a toddler, and she works full time all year round, and she works at a job that pays the state's minimum wage. Unlike a lot of women in her situation, she actually receives all the benefits that she's eligible for, and she files her taxes, and so she gets any tax credits that she's eligible for as well. Because she just had an infant this year, she takes 12 weeks of leave, and which she's eligible for under the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. And if her state provides a statewide program, then she would have that benefit as well. But in order to work, she has to send her children to childcare. And so that we can compare her across the country, we're saying that Lena sends her children to center-based care that charges the 75th percentile of the state's market rate. So that's our Lena. And we wanted to see how, when we take into consideration the wages that she earns, the medical or the paid leave benefits that she may be eligible for, the out-of-pocket childcare expenses that she would have to pay, including any co-payment on a subsidy or an additional fee if the state doesn't pay it at 75th percentile, the federal nutrition benefits, as well as the federal and state income taxes and credits. So taking all that together, many of you may have seen this before, but we've updated this year, and there's some pretty startling changes. This graphic is very busy and hard to see, but very colorful and fun to look at, because what it shows is that the range of the level of resources that Lena has available to her to provide for her family varies so substantially. If she lives in Colorado, Lena has over $54,000 in resources. But if she lives in Idaho, she has just under $21,000 in resources. She's working the same, sending her kids to the same sort of childcare and so forth. But because of state policy choices, the level of resources that she has available to her, you see, varies quite substantially. And I want to walk you through Colorado. So how does it work that she would end up with over $54,000 in resources? Well, to start with, in Colorado, their state's minimum wage is $14.42 an hour, and that would make it so that she earns just under $30,000 a year working full time at a minimum wage job. Um, but she takes time off because she had an infant. And so taking that 12 weeks off would mean that she would lose around $6,900 in earnings. But because this year Colorado implemented its paid family leave program, rather than losing $6,900 in earnings, she just loses $692 in earnings. Most of her earnings are protected during the 12 weeks that she takes off. She has to send her kids to childcare. If she did not have a subsidy, she would have to pay nearly $29,000 a year in childcare costs. And Senator Strickland was talking about how the choices families have to make are very difficult. Do you work and send your kids to childcare? Do you make enough to offset these costs? And it's very clear that in this circumstance, Lena wouldn't work to lose all of your wages to just pay for childcare. Nothing left for housing, transportation, clothing, anything. But because Colorado provides her a subsidy, she has about $1,000 copay across the year, but by and large, most of her wages are protected and she can work and send her children to care. Thinking about her federal benefits, both the nutrition benefits of SNAP and WIC in green, and the federal tax credits, both the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, that really extends the level of resources that she has available to provide for her child. She has to pay some of the federal FICA taxes and income tax, but she's up to over $42,000 in resources. But this year, because Colorado also implemented this very generous family affordability credit on top of its child tax credit, and it has a state EITC, you see that now she has over $54,000 in resources to provide for her children. And that is how Colorado moved up to ranking number 1 this year. Last year, they were ranked number 10. But you can see how their state policy choices of a paid family medical leave program, as well as a very generous child tax credit, has made it possible for her to be able to provide for her children. Now, let's look at what Montana did. They implemented 2 new policies, and let's see what difference that made. So first, they enhanced their minimum wage to now $10.30 an hour, and that's over $21,000 a year in earnings. But she has to take 12 weeks off because she just had her infant, and they don't have a paid family medical leave program. She sacrifices about nearly $5,000 in earnings by taking that 12 weeks off. And because, like I said, there isn't a paid family medical leave program in the state, then she doesn't get that back. So now she has just around $16,000 to provide for her child. But she has to send them to childcare. And if she did not have a childcare subsidy, she would have to come up with $27,000 in resources to send her children to childcare. That means that she'd have to give every dime she earned plus come up with another $11,000 from savings or something in order to send her children to childcare. And Lena's not going to do that. None of us would make that choice. But Montana does provide childcare subsidies to some of the eligible folks, and they are generous in terms of copay, but their market rate costs have gone up, but their reimbursement rates have not. So now Lena's left with these out-of-pocket costs or this additional fee in order to attend that 75th percentile location. She does get all of the federal benefits, both the nutrition benefits and the federal tax credits, and that more than doubles the resources that she has available to her. And remember now, in Montana, they have their new earned income tax credit. Rather than 3%, it's now 10%. And that's a pretty generous credit, but overall, it only increases her level of resources by close to $500 because she also has to pay some more in her state income tax. Well, when we look at how they rank from this year versus last, you can see that they didn't move up that much, even though they implemented 2 new policies. First, the change in minimum wage was not that great. It was 35 cents. Second, although the EITC is much more generous, it's still not as generous as something that Minnesota or Colorado have been doing, for instance. But the real change, because remember you have to take it all together, is that because the reimbursement rates for childcare haven't kept a pace, that all of those gains in wages and in tax credits have been lost because of the policy choices in childcare. So states really need to think holistically about how their policy choices work together to provide resources to families. And you can see how the change in Colorado, because of their paid family leave, as well as their new child tax credit, made a big difference for families there, more than about $14,000 difference, as compared to in Montana, where taking into consideration changes in income and tax credits and out-of-pocket childcare expenses leads to only about $100 difference. All right. So as we come towards the end, I want to remind you that the sole purpose for us existing is to be a resource for state leaders as you try to meet the goals that you have for infants and toddlers and parents in your state. That we want you to call on us to ask us for help. Whether it's giving a presentation to your caucus or any of your colleagues or some organization, providing legislative testimony on a particular bill or talking points or research to help you support your testimony. We do a lot of data analysis for states. We look at the policy costs, we look at the benefits, who's paying and who's losing, and so forth. We do legislative analysis for other states to really also help you to understand what other states are actually doing, what's possible, what are the policy levers that you can pull. We conduct specific research and evaluations for states to evaluate the programs that you're doing or to help you to understand the needs that you have more. And we may not be able to answer every question that you ask us, but we will find the person who can answer your question and connect you to that person if we can't. So please do not hesitate to reach out and call on us to help you as you move forward. I mean, look at these 5 cute roadmap babies. These are the 5 that we have done. This is our 5th year. And in December, we are going to be releasing a new roadmap or new report that shows you all the progress that states have made over these past 5 years. We really showed what the baseline was in 2020. And since then, 21 states have implemented 26 of our roadmap policies, and the level of investment in the strategies is just quite substantial. So we're very excited to share that, and I hope that you will look out for that release and we'll be able to use that as you start to think of your policy priorities in the years to come. If you haven't already, please, please, please check out the roadmap. There's so much there. We have summaries of your state. We have summaries of the US. We go into a lot of detail on each of our effective strategies and policies. We show you demographic characteristics, outcome measures, or hundreds and hundreds of data points. It's a lot. And if you have any questions about how you can use it or how you navigate it or whether there's something there that you aren't sure about, please do not hesitate to reach out to us, ask us. That's why we exist. Not just to have these cute gummy babies that get to smile at us all the time. And I even have one in my office now. I think I'm just going to leave it there permanently. I also want to make sure that you're all aware for the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers. I've had the opportunity to serve on the steering committee of this organization, and it really is an opportunity for folks who focus on infants and toddlers to network, to share resources, to learn about other opportunities. And if you're not a member, it doesn't cost anything. It is absolutely free, but there's a lot that you can benefit from. And so I invite you to join if you haven't, and you can find them on the web if this QR code, if you can't get to the link quite fast enough there. And finally, I asked if you would stick around to let us know how we're doing. What is it that you would like to hear about? Every year, we want to take this time to really celebrate what has happened over the past year. We want to show you how the policy choices make a difference. We want you to hear from the leaders who are working so hard to try and implement policy change. And we want to hear from you about what is working, what we could do more of, and how we can help you. So please, please, please take a moment to fill out this survey. And I cannot thank you enough for all that you do to support these babies and their parents. Our babies don't exist in isolation. We have to think of them together and figure out what we can do to make it so that they are all thriving from the start. And we hope that you will turn to our roadmap as a beginning point and as a guide for what your state can do. Thank you again for joining us today.